Well, it's probably an impossible question to answer, but we all know that Obama didn't want to be in Afghanistan, that he would like to have got out, that he must desperately want to get out of this Vietnam situation. How can he? How can he practically at the moment?
In terms of how he can practically do it, is to actually, one hates to have to say it, but basically he has to make sure that serious talks involving Taliban elements are promoted. There was a very significant report in the Herald Tribune this morning, actually, saying that NATO units in Afghanistan were actually aiding the transit of Taliban to talk to the Karzai administration. Doing very quiet behind the scenes, they're ensuring that they effectively have safe passage. But he's actually got to be prepared to do that on a larger scale. I mean, it's abhorrent to many people, the idea of Taliban elements having a share in Afghan governance. Well, I'm bound to say that if you look at some of the warlords already involved, their human rights record is probably even worse than that of the Taliban. But essentially, given what has happened, there isn't really any option. And I think, essentially, there will have to be a progressive withdrawal, which may be pretty messy, but it's got to be achieved in some way which causes minimum harm within Afghanistan.
9/11 business. I still don't know who actually did it. And I feel it's America itself who did this job. The reason is, if it is the Arab people, it's suggested they have done it, then I find it very confusing, because we are the most affluent and educated, well-to-do people in the West. And they are underdeveloped, uneducated, useless idiots. How on earth they can do this precision job? You tell me.
I think it's a bit slanderous saying that useless idiots.
Wow.
Well, let me respond, if I may. There are many conspiracy theories around 9/11 suggesting that those 19 men were not responsible for it. All I can say is that if you look at what people who examine those conspiracy theories frankly find them wanting. And certainly, my job involves looking at what the military is saying. I tracked very closely what the aviation journals were saying in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and why those planes weren't intercepted. And there were very good reasons why it wasn't possible to do it. I don't actually think that it was the United States doing it itself, must be blunt. But your second point is, how could this uneducated group of people do this? They were not uneducated, not at all. I mean, one must understand that the people who are the most senior planners in Al-Qaeda frequently have postgraduate qualifications and they're trilingual. The people who are actually in the Frankfurt-based cell that devised 9/11 were very well educated. They were architects and engineers and the rest. They were absolutely dedicated to what they were doing, but they were very well educated. And I think one is underestimating that particular movement, frankly. I don't doubt myself that that group was responsible. I don't doubt that Muslims across the world were aghast at what happened, and this represented a small group. But at the same time, my own belief is that, broadly speaking, that is what happened.
Where does this rumour come from that Al-Qaeda is being funded by the Wahhabis? Because as you pointed out, there are daggers drawn.
Well, no, quite a lot of the Al-Qaeda funding, not so much now, but certainly in the 1990s and early part of this decade, of the immediately past decade, did come from wealthy Saudi sources, not from the House of Saud, but from some wealthy Saudi sources. And that was one of the, there are other sources of funding. One of the main sources of funding at present is, as the tankers drive into Afghanistan, they have to pay protection money. So the contractors pay protection money and then pay by the Pentagon to pay that money. And one Afghan source, a reliable one, was quoted quite recently saying that he reckoned about half of the protection money actually ended up in Taliban hands.
it puzzled many of us what was the rationale for the attack on Iraq, unless you factor in oil. I don't think you mentioned oil once in the talk. You discount it entirely.
Not at all, not at all. A colleague of mine, Nick Ritchie, wrote a book. I contributed it. He wrote most of it. If you're interested, it's called The Political Road to War with Iraq. And what Nick showed was that long before Bush got elected, there was a very powerful group within the Republican Party that basically wanted regime termination in Iraq. And you can trace back right through to 1997, in Clinton's second term, this very powerful group saying we have to get rid of this regime. What was the motivation for this? Well, obviously, one of the core things was oil, not in my view to get control of Iraqi oil, so much as because of the nature of the region. The best way I can configure it is if you imagine that this is a rectangle on the Earth's surface, 1,000 miles north to south and 400 miles east to west. Plonk that down over the North Sea, the whole of the North Sea. At its peak, we have about 3.5% of the world's oil reserves. Most of that's gone now, thanks to the Thatcher government and the rest. It's been spent on other things, including unemployment in the 1980s, but that's another subject. Essentially, that was what the North Sea oil was. If you take that same rectangle and put it down over the Persian Gulf, it takes in all the United Emirates oil fields, it takes in all the Saudi fields, it takes the offshore fields, the Western Iranian fields, the Kuwaiti fields, and all the Iraqi fields right up to the Kirkuk-Mosul axis. Underneath that rectangle, same size, you have 62% of the world's oil. It's an astonishing concentration. And remember when the Iraqis went out of Kuwait in 1991, they set fire to the oil wells and they all burnt. They only burnt because the oil was coming up under pressure. You didn't even have to pump the wretched stuff up. So basically the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, is extremely important in terms of oil. And both the United States and crucially China have become progressively more dependent on oil imports. China 15 years ago was self-sufficient in oil. It now imports more than half of what it needs. The United States 30 years ago used to import about 10% from Venezuela. It's convenient to do it. Now the United States imports, I think, nearly 60% of all its oil. So yes, there was this underlying reason that it was dangerous to have Iraq under a Maverick regime and Iran, frankly, outside the pale. And even the Americans weren't quite sure about how reliable the Saudis were. And I think underlying this really puts together much more of the argument of why it was so important to get rid of that regime in Iraq. I think if 9/11 had not happened, then there would have still have been a war between the United States and Iraq during the Bush administration's first term.